Today on Miles Large TV, we're discussing the harbingers of heavy metal, the blokes from Birmingham, if you will. The one and only Black Sabbath. Sabbath is, simply put, one of my favorite bands. I can probably thank Tony Iommi for his monumental guitar influence. With all the hype surrounding the Back to the Beginning concert combined with Ozzy's passing, I felt like now was a good time to revisit them since I really hadn't for years. I really love their earlier Ozzy era stuff, but pretty much everything after the 6th album, Sabotage, is unknown territory for me. So I'm looking forward to seeing what the rest of the catalog has in store. I already know it's going to be kind of interesting, especially because going into this video I found out they had a whole slew of lineup changes through a whopping 19 studio albums. You're gonna have to strap in because it's gonna be a long one. I'll be focusing on the main studio albums, and I'll show off some riffs here and there as I am a student of Tony Iommi, and it's not a Sabbath video without some monster riffs. Let's get right into it. So this is actually the album that got me into the band, period. I was already familiar with the tracks War Pigs, Iron Man, and Paranoid, and I always thought that they were cool songs, but the first time I heard this album, I was immediately made into a Sabbath fan. What really jumps out to me about this album is that it feels very authentic. You can clearly hear all these influences from blues to jazz to folk, but the way it's executed is really unique to this band. It's almost like they invented a whole new genre of music. Another thing that's always stood out to me was the vibe. The band has gone on the record saying that their impetus was their desire to create music similar to the soundtrack of a horror film, and I think the atmosphere alone succeeds in that. It's just so dark. The first example that comes to mind is Sleeping Village and of course the title track. As far as that creepy vibe, I don't think any other album of theirs has come even close. It's excellent. For being an album that was literally recorded in a single day, it sounds surprisingly good for also being so raw. The producer, Roger Bain, did a phenomenal job at capturing the heaviness of Sabbath right from the get-go, and honestly, I think no Sabbath album sounds as great as his work on the first 3 Sabbath records. Let's get into some favorite tracks, which in the case of this album is all of them, plain and simple. I love the way the track Black Sabbath starts off. It's so mysterious and brooding with the rain and bells that you truly have no idea where it's gonna go until the guitar slams you right in the face. Ozzy's voice blends well with the music, both in his choice of melody, but even the ad-lib pleas of "Oh no, please God help me," and the outro just bangs. This won't be the last time I say this, but the band has a really great way of taking you in a direction you least expect, but still doing the music justice in every possible way. The outro is a great example of this. It kind of catches you off guard with the more technical guitar riff, faster tempo and such, but it's such a cathartic release after the slow-moving first half and ends the track off on such a high note. It's fantastic. NIB is another great one, and that riff is just so good. It's powerful, it's rude, it's a bit boneheaded, but totally cool. Behind the Wall of Sleep is also another one I love. I can't count how many times I've picked up a guitar only for that intro to come to mind and to play it. It's kind of funky in a way that I might not expect Black Sabbath to be, at least when I first heard it initially, but I've come to love it. Wicked World is also another solid one. I remember walking to my house one day and my dad just had it playing on the stereo, and just hearing that sick jazz drum intro made me go, "You can do that in metal?" There was a time where it was my all-time favorite track on this album, just because of the heavy jazz and blues influence. That break where it's just Tony Iommi playing some crazy blues riffs really speaks to me as a guitar player. But if there was just one track that really appealed to me as a guitarist, it would undeniably be A Bit of Finger, which is just that extended guitar solo that appears between both sections of Warning. Jimmy Page may have taught me how to play guitar, but Tony Iommi helped me execute it. As a blues-leaning player, I've learned so much and taken a lot from that solo. So many great ideas there, each one just building upon the last, and it's really a fantastic showcase of Tony's raw guitar skill, and another track that I highly enjoy playing for myself when I pick up a guitar. Tony's ability to come up with fun and exciting riffs to play on the guitar is unmatched. It's really undeniable that they hit it out of the park with this one. For a first release, it's one of their best albums, hands down. Everything from the riffs, the vocals, the drumming, bass, the technical ability of each band member, the production even makes it one of the best metal albums ever. I know it's maybe a bit heavy on the blues side for some people, but I'm inherently biased to love that sort of thing, and for me, it's a perfect album in that regard. I love it. It's one of my favorite albums of all time, and I can't wait to hear what they do next. Let's just get this out of the way first. This is one of the greatest heavy metal albums of all time. It's a perfect album in my books. There's not a bad track on it, there's not a bad moment on it. I feel like the band looked at what made the first album great and just refined it to a fine tip point. Everything, and I mean everything the band did on their last album was made better with Paranoid. The performances, the production, the songwriting, this album delivers it all. Let's dive into some tracks, starting off with War Pigs. The intro of this song is every bit as bombastic as its predecessor's opening track. It really just announces itself with full force, complete with air raid sirens. The simplicity of of the 2-note riff along with the chromatic part is simply genius. Tony's riffage is monster as usual, Bill's drum fills are excellent, and Ozzy's voice wailing Geezer's anti-war lyrics on top of it all is just pure metal. In a way, it's painful how this album came out over 50 years ago and its message could not be more relevant today. The chorus, or bridge sections, have some of my favorite riffs of all time. The solo is really cool as well, but one of the best parts of the track is the end. They could have very well just ended the song with that last verse, but then out of nowhere, Tony whips out this really introspective riff, and the song goes into this whole other instrumental section that really makes the song, ties it all together in a melancholic way, and ends the track perfectly. It's literally one of the greatest metal tracks of all time. It's probably one of my favorite songs ever. I mean, if you've never heard this track before, I suggest you pause the video right now and go listen to it. On a completely opposite note, Planet Caravan is so unbelievably mellow. It gives you so much space to think. I've always held the belief that every album needs a slower paced, calming tune to contrast with the upfront rock bangers, and it's probably this track specifically that helped me form this belief. But of course, the high points of this album are the loud, heavy, extended rock numbers. Tony Iommi doesn't stop pulling riff after riff out of his ass, with each one topping the next. If you thought War Pigs was riffs galore, just wait till you hear Iron Man. The main riff for this track is really just fundamental for any guitar player, but I've really come to appreciate that middle section that gets overlooked, where the band speeds up and Tony plays a totally frenetic, fast-paced solo that seemingly comes and goes out of nowhere. Electric Funeral is in a similar vein, where it has such a classic lumbering main riff, but the middle section goes bonkers, and the band adopts a funky style amidst the doom and gloom lyrics about nuclear fallout. This section was part of the reason why I even got into the band in the first place. It's so unexpected, but it works so well. Hand of Doom is also a great one. I might even say the most underrated on the album. That bass and drum solo is so funky, and that middle section is just so intense, especially given the song's topic warning against drug use. Finally, Fairies Wear Boots is just phenomenal. It chugs, it soars, it's got the best Ozzy yeah in the catalog. What's not to like about it? It serves as a perfect closer to a perfect album. Of course, the thing with Paranoid is it's an album that everyone loves and has so much praise for, and tops lists of the greatest metal albums of all time, and is probably overplayed to death, but I gotta admit, whenever I hear any song off of this album out in the wild, I can't help but to rock out. Through the years, I don't return to it as often as I used to, but every time I'm in the mood for it, it never fails to hit just right. And I think that part of it is, just like the debut, there's something really authentic about it. I mean, it was literally the springboard for so many heavy music genres that came after it. So many artists and albums draw influence from it. In the rock music pantheon, it stands at the top next to Led Zeppelin 4 and Dark Side of the Moon. It's just so visceral and raw and heavy, and there's not too many albums that have stood the test of time as well as Paranoid. It's solid front to back, and Black Sabbath's best record in my books. This album kicks ass. This is another one of those what can I say that hasn't already been said about it albums. I love it. They make it seem so effortless to follow up a classic album like Paranoid, but this album is every bit as good as that one, taking their signature sound one step further and just creating an entirely new subgenre of metal. This album is their heaviest yet, quite possibly the heaviest record they ever made. I will say as a whole, I think I like Paranoid more, but this album does have some of my all-time favorite Sabbath tracks. Production-wise, this is undeniably the best sounding Sabbath record so far. The band has gotten doomier than they've ever been with these down-tuned guitars. There are also more noticeable overdubs on this album, which really help to fill out the sound and make everything sound huge. Starting off with some of my favorite tracks, that coughing sample in Sweet Leaf is an unexpectedly cool and hilarious way to start the album, but it fits so well given the song's topic. That riff is just so classic, but I think my favorite part of the song is the transition in the middle where the song speeds up while Tony plays the fastest, craziest solo in the Sabbath catalog up to this point. Lord of this World is also a fantastically heavy track with phenomenal riffs all over it. I love the intro and verses in particular, but the song really takes off in the interlude solo sections, creating this sort of soaring and emotionally heavy feeling. I think it really helps contrast with the heavy riffs and completes the whole thing. Solitude offers a really great yet unexpected lull in an album as heavy as this. The textures created by Geezer's bass and Tony's flute melodies really nail the feelings and weight of solitude that the song conveys. Lastly, Into the Void is effectively my favorite track off of this album, and definitely a contender for favorite Sabbath track, but why wouldn't it be? It's got so many good riffs, so many unexpected transitions, and great performances by all the band members. To me, this song is the perfect representation of doom metal. It's hands down one of the heaviest songs to ever exist. That riff at the beginning might just be my favorite Black Sabbath riff of all time. I love it so much. Now that being said, as much as I love this album and I think it makes a perfect end to the trilogy of earlier Sabbath albums, it probably is my least favorite of the three. Now that's not meant to be a complaint since it's just as good as the previous albums, but for me, some of the tracks on this album are less impactful than others. Songs like After Forever and Dare I Say Children of the Grave just don't hit as hard as some of the other tracks for me. In the case of Children, I don't think it's a bad song whatsoever, but in my opinion the riff is a bit too typical and repetitive. I know people will disagree with that take, and that's fine, I'm undoubtedly in the minority on that one. But going back to my first point, although Embryo and Orchid effectively serve as intros to the songs they precede, they aren't necessarily tracks I would listen to if I went to listen to Children of the Grave or Lord of this World specifically, and as a result become a bit forgettable as time goes on. Again, I want to stress that I wouldn't skip any of these tracks if I put the full album on, considering that this album is a shorter listen, clocking in at 32 minutes, but I also think that if you're going to go for a shorter album length, then every track should count. What would probably fix this for me is if there was just more down-tuned, heavy tracks on this album. If they had done that, it probably would be my favorite Sabbath album. But of course, it is what it is, and I probably wouldn't change a thing at the end of the day. Master of Reality is a fantastic album, and a must-listen if you want to get into Black Sabbath. There's absolutely no question about that. Alright, I got my fourth Black Sabbath album, I got my can of Coke, let's get this party started. What do you mean it's not that kind of Coke? Volume 4, or Snowblind if you were the band, is a great album. I know the band was heavy into drug use at this point, but somehow despite that they were able to pull through with another winner here. Production wise, this might be their sludgiest album yet. It's absolutely filthy. I remember not liking the sound of this one as much at first, especially coming off of Master of Reality, but after getting used to it, I absolutely love the sound of the guitars on this one. They really give this album its own identity. Music wise, it feels like a continuation of some of their doomier sound, but some of the songwriting is much more upbeat than its predecessor, using more major scales, examples being Cornucopia, Supernaut, Saint Vitus Dance, and parts of Wheels of Confusion. As an early Sabbath fan, I do generally prefer the doom and gloom blues-based songs that the band exhibited on their first three albums, but that being said, I don't think the band missed a beat with this one. It's plenty heavy. Starting off with favorite tracks, I have a distinct memory of a band coming in to play at the radio station I worked at and begging us to play Supernaut. And what a fantastic song it is. Probably my favorite track on the album thanks to them. It's got a fantastic riff, great vocals, a cool drum break, and exudes this great energy that makes me want to take my car out to the countryside and floor it. It's somewhat simple in nature, but in my opinion, it's masterfully crafted and one of their finest songs. Snowblind is another favorite track of mine. All the riffs on this track are some of Sabbath's best, which makes sense in my brain seeing as I subconsciously whip them out on a regular basis anytime I pick up a guitar. I really enjoyed the structure of this song, notably that middle section that goes into a descending minor chord progression while Ozzy sings, "My eyes are blind, but I can't see." The song refers to the band's heavy use of cocaine at the time, and the way he sings it with the instrumental, it almost sounds kind of like a somber reflection, which adds this emotional element to the track that gives it more depth. Probably my favorite track listening to the album this time around was Wheels of Confusion. I think the song is a bit stiff in the beginning, holding that steady groove and that singular guitar chord, but when it picks up, it's just like any other classic Sabbath track that takes you on a journey through musical transitions you might not initially expect, which definitely makes the whole thing. And last but not least, we can't forget Under the Sun, which starts off with one of Sabbath's doomiest riffs and is just filled with great riffs throughout. I also love the outro, which kind of reminds me of that middle section of Snowblind, both songs using the minor scale to exude this feeling of melancholy. Now, if I was allowed a complaint about the album, it would simply be the flow. It starts off strong with Wheels of Confusion, tones down a bit for Tomorrow's Dream, then comes to a screeching halt at Changes. I know it's a bit of a trend for the third song on every Sabbath album to be a calmer number, but I think the flow is especially bad in the case of this album. It doesn't help that following it up with FX makes me wonder what is even going on anymore. Thankfully, the rest of the album is fantastic. And overall, I think this was the album that grew on me the most as I was combing through the catalog this go around. If you've only heard the first three Sabbath albums, you're really missing out on this one. We might start getting into less popular album territory here, but this album is every bit as great as their earlier works. Yeah, I dig this one. This album is just one step beyond what the band was doing on Volume 4. More experimentation, prog elements, and the addition of synthesizers. And like with Volume 4, expanding away from the typical heavy and sludgy blues-based riffs that we heard on previous albums. But don't worry, the riffs are still there. albeit in a slightly lesser capacity. Production-wise, I'd say it's probably in a similar vein to Volume 4, maybe slightly worse. The guitars are pretty sludgy. It feels less like mud overall thanks to the prog elements that are beginning to show up more often in place of guitar, but I still think it's below the peak production we got to hear on Master of Reality. Diving into some of my favorite tracks, let's just start off with the title track. Sabbath Bloody Sabbath is a great example to talk about the band's expanding ambitions. It starts off in pure Sabbath fashion with a great riff, but then switches to these quieter, acoustic-laden, folksy sections. The first time I heard this track I was a bit surprised, but they actually work pretty well and were reminiscent of Led Zeppelin to some degree. The back half of the track is pretty great too, where the band returns to another great bone-crushing riff with Ozzy wailing over the music like a banshee. It's great. Next up, Sabracadabra is my all-time favorite off of this album. I also love it for being home to one of my favorite Sabbath riffs of all time. That intro riff is just so sick and so catchy. Aside from a strong intro, the song itself is quite good until the band drops out, only to come back in hitting you harder than ever with another huge riff and a pair of synthesizers to boot. Honestly, the section goes hard. Like again, I'm beating a dead horse when I say this, but even 5 albums in, Sabbath never fails to exceed your expectations while taking you on a direction you least expect. This section totally rocks. The synths are a nice touch, but I think I really gotta give Ozzy the credit for his rock-solid vocal performance on this one. He does such a good job at delivering with the melodies, the subtle vocal harmonies, and even the Leslie effects are just perfect. The National Acrobat is also a great one. It's quite doomy with some fantastic blues-based riffs throughout. Lastly, Killing Yourself to Live is just another solid, sprawling track, even though the intro to this track is pretty much the same as Sabbath Bloody Sabbath, albeit in the key of F sharp. It's pretty standard in the first section, but I absolutely love the switch up in the second half, where the song does a complete 180, picks up tempo, and just is completely riffs galore for Tony, where the riffs quite literally just keep coming and keep taking you further and further away from how the song originally started. It's quite the wild ride. As much as I love those tracks, this album does have quite a few misses for me. My main complaint about this album is, aside from these few strong favorite tracks, the deeper cuts don't really have much going for them. Personally, I think the back half of the album is a bit lacking. Looking for Today and Spiral Architect both feel like a natural extension of some of those major key sections of Volume 4. They're not bad by any means whatsoever. In fact, I do enjoy Spiral Architect a bit, with that lovely chord progression in the chorus with the string arrangements, but they're a step below my favorites on this album. Fluff, on the other hand, is quite literally just fluff. It's a filler track for me. It sounds a bit too generic and doesn't have any qualities that help me identify it as Sabbath. Lastly, and I mean no disrespect to Ozzy, God rest his soul, but I think Who Are You is probably one of the worst Sabbath songs up to this point. I'll give it credit for that lovely bridge section, but the main riff is just so odd, and it barely fits in with the Sabbath sound. It's a good thing this was just a one-off thing though, and it's not like we have a new agey synthesizer era of Sabbath to look forward to. As far as my overall thoughts on this album, it's got some of my favorite tracks in the Sabbath catalog, but also a few of the most forgettable ones. I am a bit mixed on it, and I'm not sure I can really say I enjoy it as an album in its entirety, but I guess in a way I feel similarly about Master of Reality, so yeah, it's good. At the very least, the favorite tracks I mentioned are bangers, and it's the reason I keep coming back to listen to it. It kind of amazes me that 6 albums in, the band is still able to bring in great quality stuff that I think is on par with a lot of the material on their earlier albums. The performances on this album are phenomenal. Even if this album was marred by lawsuits and drugs, the band played like they were in their prime. The production on this album is insane. For me, it's right up there with Master of Reality. The guitars cut like a knife through the mix, Ozzy's voice sounds so huge, and the rhythm section sounds so full, really bringing every song to life. Starting off with favorite tracks, we gotta talk about Symptom of the Universe. It's hands down my favorite track on this album, probably even one of my favorite Sabbath tracks of all time. I know people notice I snuck the main riff into a few of my videos in the past. What's great about this track is the riffs, which just proves time and time again that Tony Iommi is the riff king. The other thing I love about this track is the crazy structure that is constantly shifting. Things are being added. Once again, they're taking you in directions you least expect with that crazy ass outro. Like, it totally comes out of nowhere, but adds the funkiest, grooviest, laid-back section to a Sabbath track and somehow just fits perfectly. Moving on to Megalomania, the band delivers another banger. The creepy intro that slowly builds is really atmospheric, and then of course when the tempo picks up, it's a solid rocker, with really insane vocals by Ozzy. I can't believe how high he can sing. I love this song, but personally I admit it's a bit on the lengthy side, and the band doesn't really do much with it after introducing the second section, but hey, it's still solid. And let's not forget Hole in the Sky, which predates Metallica's groove metal phase by about 20 years. This track absolutely fucks. It's a no-nonsense rocker, and it's a great way to open the album coming after its more prog-influenced predecessor. And this was actually my first time listening to the Rit, which honestly kind of reminded me of Rush with that intro in which Ozzy sings as high as he possibly can, but I think this was a really great track and a really pleasant way to close the album, especially with Ozzy telling us that everything will be just fine. Surprisingly, Ozzy's synthesizer contribution to this album, Am I Going Insane, unlike the previous album, is kind of a banger. I think that like Who Are You, it still doesn't quite hit the mark of what I imagined the Black Sabbath sound to be, but rather I want to give it credit for being just a really well-crafted song in melody and structure and chord choices. It's far from my favorite track on the album, but Ozzy definitely redeemed himself with this one. Now, for all the praise I've had for this album, for me it does suffer in a similar way that Sabbath Bloody Sabbath does, in that it has some of my favorite Sabbath tracks, but the deeper cuts on this album I don't find myself revisiting much that often. Maybe it's just me, but the back half of the album is considerably weaker than the front, with the exception of the Rit. Aside from that, overall I think this album is a bit edgier and at times hits harder than the previous two albums. It certainly feels like a straight rock album in some places, but I think that all the band's experimenting from the previous two albums has started to take the form of more progressive rock type sound. And seeing as for the rest of this video we'll be talking about Black Sabbath albums I've never heard before, maybe they'll continue this progressive rock trend and something cool will come of it. I can't wait to see what happens next. Alright, I changed my mind. Yeah, I can't really say in all earnestness that I enjoyed this album much, if at all. For me, this album can be summed up with the statement, oh, it's a fine album, but it's kind of a terrible Black Sabbath album. To me, part of the appeal of Black Sabbath is that they offer a darker, heavier version of rock music that's unique enough to set them apart from their contemporaries. And for this album, they decided to completely throw that out the window. This album sounds like Black Sabbath was trying really hard to be anything but themselves. I keep getting flashes of other bands and songs from the era that I don't really care for. For example, when Backstreet Kids starts up, it's exciting, it has prog elements thrown at you right from the get-go with a tempo change, and overall it's not bad. But then Ozzy's voice comes in and I'm like, oh yeah, I forgot I was listening to Black Sabbath. The thing is, I have no problems with any artist or band making an attempt to branch out and change up their sound, but I think there are ways you can do it that holds true to the band's original identity, combining new elements without becoming identity deficient. In the case of Technical Ecstasy, it sounds like the band is attempting to be a combination of Rush and Foreigner and Journey and Boston. There are some hints of Sabbath here and there. I think certain sections of You Won't Change Me and Dirty Women bring out that doomy heaviness that cemented the band in rock history, but it's a bit too prog for my personal tastes. Don't get me wrong, obviously the band has had their share of prog moments up to this point, but on Technical Ecstasy there's just not enough doom to offset the prog, if you get what I mean. In fact, the whole album just sounds too pleasant in a way that doesn't fit with the Sabbath style. And it's not like the band hasn't done more pleasant sounding music in the past with all those major key songs I pointed out on past albums, but the doomy atmosphere that the band is so heavily identified with is more or less completely absent all over this album. A great example of this would be the track It's Alright. I genuinely thought my music library had just switched to some auto-generated playlist of some obscure 70s rock bands no one's ever heard of. I think the musicianship is nice, and Bill Ward's voice is unexpectedly soothing, but coming off an album that had Symptom of the Motherfucking Universe on it, it was quite the shock. I suppose it's enjoyable in its own way, but do I really count on Black Sabbath to get my pop ballad fix in? All that aside, I did actually enjoy the Pink Floyd-esque She's Gone for what it was. Kind of. But overall, I probably won't revisit this album much, if at all. There's just not much that it offers that I personally look for when I want to listen to Sabbath. Of course, if you like this album, that's completely fine. I'm not going to fight you on it. I have no quarrel. As I said before, I don't think it's an outright bad album by any means, but for me, this album marks the end of an era, and in a way, the end of a band I came to know and love. I didn't like this album. I know some people enjoy this one, and if that is you, more power to you. You're welcome to listen to Johnny Blade till your stylus is completely worn out. In my opinion, this album sounds really uninspired and rushed, which given the circumstances of the state of the band at the time, it kind of makes sense how it ended up this way. This album just sounds tired, boss. It doesn't hit hard, it's just okay-ish. Even the production is pretty weak, like it sounds so flat and lifeless. And music-wise, it's no better. Part of the problem is you have some pretty long track lengths for pretty uneventful songs that don't really have a lot going for them. There's no classic Sabbath detours, no structure changes, it's just so stripped back and goes on and on that it almost puts me to sleep at times. And can someone please get the synthesizer away from the band? I would get into my favorite tracks from this album, but I think there are none. Like maybe some parts here and there were cool. The title track kind of starts off a bit exciting, energetic even, but overall I found the track to drag on a bit longer than I would have liked for something so simple. The verses of Junior's Eyes are unexpectedly funky, and I did enjoy the groove, but the chorus just sounds so painfully boring. Somehow, of all the tracks on this album, Air Dance was the most exciting, probably due to the jazzy nature of the track, since I do like jazz. It's very texture driven and that piano's borderline gorgeous. However, I will concede it sounds nothing like Sabbath. In fact, I was getting hints of Santana, Frank Zappa, and that Jazz Sabbath tribute album of all things. Aside from these mentions, I pretty much struggled through the rest. Johnny Blade sounds like some kind of TV theme song, which is weird. for Sabbath. It's also almost 7 minutes long and barely anything happens in it. Like Into the Void is a minute shorter, and that track is jam-packed with so many different parts musically. It's infinitely much more exciting compared to this track. Breakout is probably the most bizarre song purely by Black Sabbath arrangement standards. I can see the jazz leanings of this track, but the horn arrangements sound too much like a pop track than jazz to my ears. Swinging the Chain is once again Black Sabbath attempting to be a different artist like in Technical Ecstasy. Bill's got some decent vocals, I'll give him that, but once again this song is very far removed from what constitutes Black Sabbath in my mind. And as for the rest of the tracks, they were all so painfully dull and derivative that I couldn't think of a single thing to say about them. Overall, yeah, this album kinda sucks. I'm not even gonna hesitate to say it's the worst Sabbath album so far in my opinion. I don't like it. It just sounds like a bunch of garbled, half-baked ideas that weren't fully developed. I don't even know if I'm comfortable in saying that. It just seems like the band just gave up with this one. At least with Technical Ecstasy, I came away from it like the band put in a considerable amount of effort, even if I didn't enjoy it. With Never Say Die, it feels like they didn't even try. The entire album is just so forgettable, and I might argue that's a fate worse than just being a straight up bad album. Give me a D! Give me an I! Give me an O! I think this one is pretty good. It actually feels like a proper album in its totality. The production on this thing is tight, the guitars are crushing just like on Sabotage. It's hard to believe that the tired performance of Never Say Die preceded this album because the band just sounds so full of life now. I guess a lineup change will do that to you. The addition of Ronnie James Dio is nice. His vocal style brings this operatic quality to the music that diverges from Ozzy's more straightforward delivery. His voice carries this sort of very confident swagger all over the album. The music itself is maybe not as doomy as past Sabbath offerings, but I think that the band's signature sound is far more present here than it was on the past two albums, and as a result it feels like a proper return to form, even if there are a few moments here and there that are a bit Foreigner-esque like on Technical Ecstasy. Going into favorite tracks, Neon Nights makes for a really solid opener. Dio's voice adds this invigorating energy to the band that is carried throughout the entire album. The title track is also really cool. That opening riff is just such a classic riff. They're almost towering in contrast to the more atmospheric verses. Die Young is also another one I really enjoy. The atmospheric Pink Floyd sounding intro and midsections were really cool in particular. One thing I noticed about this album is that Tony's guitar work is a bit less riff focused and shifting more towards chord changes, which isn't necessarily new, but with Dio's melodic delivery it works well most of the time, until you get a track like Lady Evil that is fairly the same throughout, kind of like in an AC/DC sort of way, which isn't inherently bad, but it's a bit too stiff for Sabbath. Similarly, Walking Away sounds like some other hard rock band of the era and is fairly derivative, but that's just my opinion. Now, of all the great things I've said about this one, there is something about this album that doesn't quite sit right with me. I do think this is a really great album, full stop. The music sounds great and I would much rather listen to this album than the last two Ozzy albums any day of the week. That said, I think there's something about this album that falls a bit short of the classic albums that I've known and loved for years. I know I can chalk it up to personal bias, but to me this record sounds a bit more commercial, is that the right word? Commercial in a way that Black Sabbath hasn't necessarily sounded before, perhaps. The more I listened to it, the more I was reminded of these other big heavy metal acts throughout the 80s. I'm sure for its time it probably felt less contrived than it does for me right now in 2025, but here and now the music is somewhat more accessible, perhaps conventional as what I'd expect of the heavy metal genre. And really at the end of the day, I think the difference, plain and simple, is what Dio brings to the band. With Ozzy at the helm, they sound like the four working class guys that started back in the late 60s. The attitude of the music was far more gloomy, downtrodden, still full of life, but always with an element of darkness. With Dio at the helm, this new era of Sabbath sounds more theatrical, bombastic, and dare I say triumphant. Probably the best example of this is the lyrics. The lyrics of Ozzy era Sabbath seem much more focused on issues that ail the common man, things like war and drug use. They felt more based in reality a lot of the time, but if they ever did deviate to something more fantastical, you get something like a cautionary tale like an Into the Void. Science fiction, yet something that could still be interpreted as a metaphor for our modern era. Dio, on the other hand, is singing about dragons and kings and demons and enough stuff to create his very own D&D campaign. And that's not exactly a bad thing, and not to say that Ozzy also didn't sing about those things, but as a result the album lacks a bit of edge to me. Instead, Dio's vocal delivery really brings this metaphorical charisma to the music and makes it sound more rock-based. Maybe it's more flashy, fantastical, and a departure from what I loved about earlier Sabbath albums. But that being said, I don't necessarily think that this is an outright bad thing. It's far more unified and focused in one direction than the last two Ozzy albums, and I can see that being a good thing and a bad thing, depending on how you look at it. Of course, that's all just my personal opinion. I know for some people this is the first Sabbath record that they listen to. The Dio era of Sabbath for them is something that they love as much as I love the Ozzy era of Sabbath, and that's fine. As an Ozzy fan, I still think it's a great album. Give me a D! Gimme an I, gimme an O. To me, this album sounds like a heavier sequel to Heaven and Hell. It is somewhat strikingly similar in terms of song and flow, though I will say the guitars crunch even harder than on the previous album. Everything hits noticeably harder than before, which I feel like gives the album far more edge, which I appreciate. I know Heaven and Hell is probably the more iconic album, but I enjoyed this one for its heavier qualities. Overall performances on this one are just as tight, production is again a bit more edgy, the guitars growl much more, but it helps it stand apart from the previous album. Getting into some of my favorite tracks, the opener Turn Up the Night kicks off great, but again, I'm getting flashbacks to the previous album as it's too reminiscent of the opener to Heaven and Hell, Neon Nights, with the similar chugging guitar riff. That said, this track cuts through a bit more and also has elements of Queen, which is kind of interesting for Sabbath. Falling Off the Edge of the World is a pretty cool, sprawling, epic piece. I love its slow building nature, and as a result, it carries a lot of weight, both musically and emotionally. Voodoo is a pretty cool, if not fairly standard rock number. I didn't really care too much for Country Girl, but the band changes it up in the middle section, which I really enjoyed and I think makes the song much better for me. Finally, the title track is my all-time favorite track of this era, mainly due to that kick-ass guitar riff. It's a proper heavy track, definitely single material, but I think it just absolutely rips. It's shorter, concise, what more could you want in a rock and roll song? Overall, I think this is a good album, but I do think that aside from my favorites here, I don't really know if I would revisit the others on this album. Slipping Away reminds me too much of the Rolling Stones' Can't You Hear Me Knockin', but not as good. E5150 is obviously just a transition piece. The Sign of the Southern Cross in some respects is similar to Falling Off the Edge of the World, or vice versa, despite my preference for the latter. As much as the band adds much more ferocity and edge to their sound, I do think it's less memorable in that there's a lot it shares in common with its predecessor. Looking back on these two albums, I do think they are fairly decent offerings on their own, and at the end of the day, we have Dio to thank for prolonging Black Sabbath's career so they could deliver to us such great albums as The Eternal Idol, Seventh Star, and Tear. Alright, I'm kidding, but I do think these Dio albums are pretty decent overall, even if I might not find myself revisiting them as much as the Ozzy stuff. Ew. What's with this cover? We should all agree never to judge a book by its cover, but I'm gonna be honest, I totally did that with this album before listening to it, because that is some hideous album art, and nothing anyone can say will ever change my mind. The color palette is just so uninviting, that font Photoshop job is awful, and the baby just kinda looks ugly in a lame sort of way. But look, we're here to talk about the album, not the art. So, how's the music? Well, it's the first and only Black Sabbath album to feature Ian Gillan of Deep Purple fame. Right from the title track Trash, I could tell I was in for something. Ian's vocal delivery turns the grandfathers of heavy metal into what I would probably just describe as excessive party rock. Compared to Dio, it feels like they leaned harder than ever into the hard rock heavy metal thing, and I don't enjoy it as much as I did the last two albums. First of all, what's up with the production on this thing? The guitar is like all mids, and the drum sound is 80% cymbals. It sounds more like a punk album than a Black Sabbath album. And just to verify that I wasn't crazy, I went to listen to Metallica's debut album, which was released in the same year, mind you, and that sounded so much better sonically. I think the performances are decent on this one, but at the same time, the production just saps all the excitement and makes it hard to tell in a way. But look, if you want the Tony Iommi Born Again lead tone, just plug in a Boss DS1 and then crank the tone up, and you have the miles large guarantee that it's accurate as it is awful. As far as my favorite tracks go, let's start with Disturbing the Priest, which I felt is actually a pretty solid track, and I think helped me better appreciate Ian's vocals meshing with the Sabbath sound. Instrumentally, this actually felt somewhat like a Sabbath song through and through. Very great use of the blues and minor scales, the vibe was definitely there. I also really enjoyed the intro and verses of Zero the Hero. The intro was evocative of that doomy Sabbath sound. Similarly, the title track has this really cool guitar melody throughout the verses of that track. That flanger-soaked guitar exudes this contemplative and melancholic mood that I enjoyed, and felt like these sections could fit on an album like Volume 4. But aside from these standout moments, I feel a bit conflicted about this album, because although, as I said, these few things fit well within the Sabbath catalog and have elements that are recognizably part of the Sabbath sound, a lot of the songs on this album are just very identity deficient, like they were recorded and played by some random forgotten 80s metal band. Specifically, the entire back half of the album. I'd argue heavily that Digital Bitch, Hotline, and even Trash don't sound a damn thing like Sabbath, just on a fundamental style level. I mean, I know part of this is simply just Ian Gillan's vocals. He's a talented vocalist for sure, and I'm not knocking his vocal chops, but his bravado and delivery is a bit out of place for Sabbath. Overall, I wouldn't say I'm a huge fan of this one. It has 3 of the founding members of Sabbath, but sounds less like them overall than some of the Dio stuff. Production is a flaming pile of ass. I saw an article saying that Tony Iommi is considering remixing this one, and I would love it if he did that because I can hardly stand to listen to it as is. I do want to say at this point in the video, in case it's not already obvious, I'm totally biased in my love for that heavy, doomy, early Sabbath sound, and it's a bit of an exercise in futility to try to want to hear that in any of these later Sabbath albums because effectively at this point they were fundamentally a different band. We're barely really just scratching the surface of Sabbath deep cut albums here, and you might not like what I have to say about these upcoming 10 or so albums, but it's all just my opinion. As always, I'm going to give each and every one a fair shot. I don't really like to use this word to describe music, but this album is as mid as it gets. This album effectively serves as a Tony Iommi solo record, mainly because he was the only remaining founding member of Black Sabbath to take part of the recording of this album. I read that even Tony wanted it to just be a Tony Iommi album, but the record label pressured him to release it under the Black Sabbath name, so here we are. What could the father of heavy metal come up with? Well, simply put, it sounds nothing like Black Sabbath. If anything, this album reminded me of Boston right from the start. And like I said before, this is a problem for a band so established and genre defining. Overall, it just sounds like another dated hard rock album. It came out in 1986, but I could have believed it came out a decade before, which already makes the album seem more dated. The new vocalist, Glenn Hughes, who like Ian Gillan was also in Deep Purple, just has the most conventional 70s rock singer delivery that is fine on its own, but for Sabbath it just comes across as bland. I do think that there are very subtle hints of the Sabbath sound. For example, the title track in the guitar solo section has some of those more evil, heavy, and spooky qualities of some of their previous material. It's probably on par with some of the Born Again stuff that I liked, but in the entire album, this one section was the only section I could say I enjoyed. As far as the rest of the album, I wouldn't call it metal whatsoever. It lacks the darker edge, the signature sound, and feel of any of Sabbath's earlier works. There's these synths all over it that I suppose are intended to add texture and atmosphere, but they just really date the album instead. The plus side is the album's only 34 minutes long, so if you're highly compelled after all I said to check it out, it probably wouldn't hurt that bad if you really didn't like it. I'm sure it's fine if you enjoy this era of hard rock, but aside from the title track, there was hardly anything that stuck out to me as something I would be compelled to revisit. And honestly, I don't want to revisit this one. It didn't excite me in any way. All that said though, I'm not going to be too hard on this album. Again, it pretty much is just a Tony Iommi solo record. He has his moments and a few good riffs here and there, just overall as an album, it's kind of mediocre. This is the first Sabbath album to feature Tony Martin as a vocalist. His style is somewhat comparable to Dio's, but noticeably more restrained, at least it is in this album. To me, he's not as bombastic as Dio, not really a complaint, but just a personal observation. What's that? Oh, okay. Future Miles tells me this will improve over time. Honestly, I would probably describe listening to this album as torturous, which I find somewhat ironic seeing as the album cover seemed like it could be interesting. It kind of exudes this mysterious, dark quality, but in reality what we're left with is yet another hard rock Sabbath album. I sense that this album is foreshadowing most of the rest of the band's career, but the Eternal Idol, in my opinion, is in effect eternally boring. It came out in 1987, so that means Metallica's already dominated the metal scene for 4 years at this point, having released Ride the Lightning and the seminal Master of Puppets. And look, I don't necessarily mean to compare the two bands as they are fundamentally different beasts, but at the same time, understanding the greater musical landscape at the time is kind of important to understanding the music to some extent, in my opinion. I would imagine that like Seventh Star, this album also sounded dated upon release, and frankly, it's albums like this that were the reason that Nirvana and alternative rock happened in the first place. The styles, the riffs, everything about this album just sounds so overdone time and time before. In fact, even after multiple listens, it was hard to keep track of what songs were what, just because all the riffs kind of blend in with one another. It's only 9 minutes longer than Seventh Star, but those 9 minutes feel like an eternity. Now that said, if there was one redeeming quality about this album, it would be the title track. It actually doesn't sound too bad. It kind of reminds me of that intro section to Megalomania from Sabotage. The riffs and the overall mood of the song are so much more doomier than anything Tony has done on the past two albums, and I could genuinely see this track fitting on one of the older albums, at least some of the Dio stuff. It was almost liberating to hear an actual proper Sabbath track after all this hard rock slop. It's just a bit of a shame you have to sit through the whole album to get to it. Aside from that, I guess I also enjoyed Scarlet Pimpernel for some of the nice textures it provided. It kind of reminded me a bit of Laguna Sunrise from Volume 4. Look, if I'm going to force myself through this catalog, I want to be able to enjoy something, or find some redeeming qualities that help to make the experience less miserable. But yeah, aside from those two tracks, you can just skip this album. Unless you're a huge Tony Martin fan, or a really huge hard rock fan, and I mean like this is your genre, I don't know if you'll find much value in the Eternal Idol. Okay, this album is better than the last one, for sure. This album offers a considerable improvement over the last two, maybe even the last three albums, depending on what you think about Born Again. It's the last three for me, for sure. First of all, production on this album is really good. I might even argue it's a bit overproduced. Tony Martin's vocals are noticeably improved. I genuinely think his delivery is so much more confident and cuts through the mix better this time around. And the sound of the guitars and the band are as massive as ever. The instruments sound absolutely huge. Although it kind of sounds similar to Pink Floyd's A Momentary Lapse of Reason in that the drums have that huge reverberated 80s sound that dates the album a bit. bit, but again, compared to the last 3 albums, it's better. As far as the music, it's a slightly less conventional hard rock sound. Personally, it's not as identity deficient as the few albums that preceded it, but at the same time, they're still not breaking any new ground here. If anything, we're making a return to the Dio sound of the early 80s. As far as my favorites go, the title track is probably the best track to showcase exactly what I mean when I say the production sounds huge. Those guitars sound like they're towering above you, and Tony Martin sounds like he's singing in a massive auditorium. When Death Calls sounds particularly heavy, probably the heaviest track on the album. Tony Iommi has returned to the evil, doomy riff game, which is heard on quite a few tracks on this album, but in general, they're kind of few and far in between. I'd love to hear them, but I just wish that was the focus more than anything in the music. Like, for example, Kill in the Spirit World reminds me of a Scorpions track, but at the end of the first verse, Tony Iommi plays this crazy, weird, and interesting riff that I just wish we got more of instead of being sandwiched between a typical chord progression. Same with Nightwing. It's mainly a ballad overall, but at the end of every verse, there's this really cool riff that Tony plays, and I just wish we got more of that. But instead we have a ballad, a Black Sabbath ballad. Cool. Overall, this album isn't that bad. It's definitely the best Sabbath album in a while. I think Tony Iommi's playing and performances are rock solid, and he's got some great solos on this one. Tony Martin is certainly pulling his weight this time around and is really coming into his element here. But for myself personally, it's a bit of a pass. I personally think it just sounds kind of like a rehash of the Dio era, which of course is not a bad thing, but not my personal favorite era of the band. What I kind of wish Sabbath did instead of all this hard rock stuff was to go back to their roots and heavily experiment with the idea of creating a soundtrack to a horror film. Make more tracks like the track Eternal Idol. I think even if it was just Tony Iommi and Tony Martin at this point, what did they have left to lose? I would have liked to see the results of that, but of course I can only dream. So, I'm not gonna lie, the moment I pressed play on this album, I feel like I blacked out and then it was over. Like my first listen to this album, I retained none of it, which is probably not a good sign. Coming away from it, my feelings for this one are similar to Headless Cross, but with 2 additional complaints. The first is, why so much reverb on the snare? And the second is, this album features very prominent synthesizer parts that are very unlike Sabbath. They sound kinda cheesy at times and almost just exist to fill out the sound since they're not doing anything different from the guitars. Production-wise, it's not as huge sounding as Headless Cross, which is a bit of a shame since the production on that one was pretty good. Oh, and I think the Norse mythology concept in of itself isn't a bad idea, but I admit it was not something I expected of Black Sabbath, and I don't think it adds anything to the music whatsoever. As far as some of my favorite tracks, my favorite of all of them was The Lawmaker. It sounds kinda cool. The up-tempo nature of this track really kinda woke me up from the slower tunes on Headless Cross, and helped this album stand apart from that one. The guitar work is very driving in a really cool, soaring type of way, like it's a powerful, moving riff, but far more delicate than the giant chords of some of the tunes in the past album. Aside from this though, I didn't enjoy much else. The Sabbath Stones offers what is probably the album's heaviest offering, but in a way it's not quite heavy enough for my tastes. Maybe the production is part of the problem with that. Jerusalem hits some of those high points that we heard previously on Headless Cross. It's cool, but I think I'd rather listen to the previous album if I wanted that vibe. Aside from that, I'm just getting these hard rock flashbacks all over the place on this one. For example, Valhalla sounds pretty grand, and I wouldn't call it a bad track, but I can't really get into it. I don't really see myself coming back to this album much, if at all, aside from those few tracks that I mentioned. The thing is, I don't believe these Tony Martin eras are outright bad, but I think they have the technical ecstasy issue for me where I recognize they're put together works, but I personally just can't get into them, and that's purely a me thing, I know. So fun fact, this video is so damn long, this is my second day of recording. I actually recorded for 2 hours yesterday. Do I look a day older? Anyway. This album kinda rips. I honestly think this might be my favorite album of their post-Sabotage albums, even better than the other Dio albums. I know that might seem like a crazy, controversial claim, but right from the first track, it's apparent that Sabbath has brought back the doom and gloom. I think part of it is you could argue the music on albums like Headless Cross were heavy for sure, but the heaviness of Dehumanizer's riffs and music are downright evil. There's far more use of minor scales, tritones, less of that major scale nonsense going on. It's like Black Sabbath remembered how to be interesting again. The music overall is a bit more riff-based than it has been in a long while, and it really feels somewhat like a proper return to form for me on some tracks. Production on this thing sounds noticeably more raw, better than Born Again, but it almost sounds like they got Steve Albini in for this thing. The drums sound like they were recorded in the same room as the Pixies' Surferosa. In a way though, I kinda appreciated it. It was a nice change of pace from the overproduced sound of Headless Cross, and it wasn't so raw that it sounded bad. The guitars and even Geezer's bass sound absolutely crushing, harsh, and downright menacing. Of course we can't forget Dio's great performance either. I think that he really knocked it out of the park with this one. Let's waste no time diving into favorite tracks because there are a few. The start-stop riff of Computer God is just so unbelievably heavy and almost snaps you to attention every time the band drops out. It's such a good riff that defies your expectations and is interesting dynamically, especially since Dio continues to sing in those empty spaces. TV Crimes is almost punk in nature with Sabbath's own evil twist. I do think a track like this was long overdue in the Sabbath catalog, seeing as punk has evolved for over a decade at this point, but nonetheless I think it's a great track for making the band sound as revitalized as ever. And I think riff of the album we have to hand over to Master of Insanity, no contest. Such a wacky, musically unexpected, but perfectly fitting riff for Sabbath. I read it was actually the riff of the guitarist of Geezer's band, so I'm not entirely sure we can credit Sabbath to this one, but nonetheless, it was still completely unexpected in the best way possible. Lastly, After All, The Dead is just bone-crushing. Its slower tempo combined with that haunting intro makes for a pretty great Sabbath number. As much as this was the first Sabbath album in a while that I can say I really enjoyed, it's not without its shortcomings. There were a few songs on here that felt bland at best in my opinion, which is something I felt about the deeper cuts on other Dio albums. But despite this, I know I came away with a positive experience overall, and I think that in the future whenever I put this album on, I'd probably listen to it all the way through and by extension start to enjoy some of those tracks more. I don't know if it beats out any of the Ozzy era stuff for me, but regardless, it's decent. It's a more proper metal album than the past, 5 albums? 9 if you're gonna argue that the earlier Dio era isn't proper metal, which I don't know if I'd go that overboard. But it's their best album in a while for me, and possibly my favorite Dio era album period. This one's not terrible. This might be my favorite of the Tony Martin era. I kind of hesitate to say that because I wouldn't say I really enjoyed it all that much, probably about the same as Headless Cross, but what makes this album stand apart from the other Martin era albums is it doesn't exactly feel derivative some of the time. The tracks don't all meld together as one amorphous blob of 80s metal. We might have Geezer to thank for that since he stuck around for this one. There's a lot more unexpected key changes which are cool because they give the tracks a new dimension, but sometimes they're too far out there which makes some of the parts come off as detached. I think that it sounds noticeably more metal compared to the previous Martin albums, and I'm wondering if Tony Iommi and Geezer coming off of Dehumanizer is part of that change. There are definitely more riffs on this one compared to Tear and Headless Cross, I think. Production-wise, it's pretty good. Not as grand as Headless Cross, but I think it serves the music well. I find it funny that the past 10 albums are just so inconsistent with production, but at the same time, it's not just the production, but also the lineup that's inconsistent with this era of Sabbath. But I digress. Getting into some of my favorite tracks, Psychophobia had some great riffs throughout. I think this track is a prime example if I wanted to showcase how different this album was from the earlier Martin era albums. Virtual Death was great as well. Those vocal harmonies are just A1, and the overall slow pace really brings out the doomy vibe. Back to Eden has a great blues-based guitar riff that I like, but it also kind of reminds me of Runaway Baby by Bruno Mars, or I guess Bruno Mars reminds me of the Sabbath since they came first, but it's still a cool riff regardless. But the rest of the song, I didn't care for. And that's kind of the thing with this album. It has some good moments, but I wouldn't necessarily say that even the full tracks really click with me. Like another example being the tempo changes in Immaculate Deception. They ramp up the energy, but I do think the fast sections are the best parts of the song, whereas the slower sections sound like other Tony Martin era albums. Similarly, Dying for Love isn't bad. It has some great overdubbed guitar textures, but the song sounds nothing like Black Sabbath whatsoever. Like with some of the other albums in this era, I think there were a handful of songs that I just didn't care for at all because they did the typical 80s metal thing. I think it's partially due to Tony Martin's delivery. This is my 4th album hearing his voice, and unfortunately it's something that still doesn't really speak to me. As for my overall consensus, yeah, it's alright. Again, I enjoy it for its deviations from the tired hard rock heavy metal sound we've heard on album after album up to this point. There's a few standouts on this one maybe I'll revisit in the future. Still though, I think compared to Dehumanizer, I would much rather listen to that any day of the week. Possible favorite of the Tony Martin era? Sure, but I wouldn't say I enjoyed it a lot. You know, after that last one, I was hoping we'd be on a trend to continue and improve and end the Tony Martin era with a bang, but I guess I should not have held my expectations that high. If anything, this album just feels like an extension of the last one, but far less diverse, which feels like a step down as a result. At best, I would probably describe this album as inoffensive. It's just regurgitating a lot of the Tony Martin era stuff that came before. I will say production on this album is good, but for reference, I listened to the remix version because apparently the original one is bad. I did go and listen to a bit of the original, and my consensus is the original sounds very mono and everything's clustered together in the mix, whereas the remix version sounds more spread out, which is great, but the guitars have this sort of sterile modern metal sound that I personally dislike. It's clean, but maybe a bit dated at this point. I have to say, the album sounded fine upon pressing play on the first track, The Illusion of Power, but then Tony Martin's vocals came in and they were way too dramatic for my taste. Overall, the song wasn't too bad, but then the rap vocals come in. Yes, rap vocals on a Sabbath track. I will admit I was taken aback for a moment, but I quickly realized it was Ice-T, who's done similar work in his band Body Count, namely that Comfortably Numb cover, which I enjoy. I think Ice-T's vocals are fine, but conversely, I'm not a big fan of the Tony Martin vocals here. I think that Tony's rap sections in the song would have been better done by Ice-T while delegating him to the more operatic choruses. Of course, for a Black Sabbath track, it's fairly odd to throw in a rap feature as it is, but I've certainly heard worse features, and to their credit, it is a memorable moment on the album. The only other track I enjoyed aside from the first one was Can't Get Close Enough. It starts off rather pleasant and atmospheric, and it reminded me of Norwegian Wood by the Beatles, which kind of made me forget I was listening to a Sabbath album until the heavy guitars burst in. It's not the most amazing track, but I enjoyed enjoyed it. However, I soon ran into the big problem with this album. It seems rather formulaic in of itself. You have some tracks that do the quiet atmospheric thing before the band comes crashing in loud, or you have a fairly standard rock track, and that's it. Those are the only two types of songs on this album, and they alternate and sometimes repeat. And instead of coming across as the titan of a metal band, this album is as light as Aerosmith in some spots. And if that's the case, I would rather just go back and listen to Aerosmith, and I'm not even that much of an Aerosmith fan. Like, the choruses in Rusty Angels sound kinda good, but not for Black Sabbath. I don't really want this in my Sabbath song. As far as overall judgment, I would probably not go out of my way to listen to it again. If anything, I probably won't revisit this album in its entirety until I revisit the Tony Martin era again to give it another shot, if I even do that. As far as the Tony Martin era goes as a whole, I wouldn't say I actively enjoyed it. If you're an Ozzy era fan like me, you probably won't find a lot that will appeal to you. But if you're a Dio fan, all these albums will more or less be up your alley. It's all good and well put together music if you're a fan of this era of rock and metal, but personally, it doesn't really excite me like the Ozzy era of Sabbath does. You can't fault me for trying though. Going into this, I wanted to give it a fair shot, but that is my takeaway. So I actually wasn't even going to talk about this album. I only discovered it after I'd written like 95% of the script, but I figured technically it fits in with the theme of Sabbath, especially considering it's just the Mob Rules Dehumanizer lineup under a different name. As far as the album goes, yeah, it's okay. It exists. It's an album with music on it. I don't think anyone would be upset in my saying it's the weakest of all the Dio albums. It really just reminds me of some of the Tony Martin era stuff, and above all else I might argue that Dio's performance is a bit more tired sounding than on some of the previous albums. Like with the past, I don't know, 8 albums or something, there's cool moments I suppose. Rock and Roll Angel has a few nice guitar lines, and those breakdowns where all the instruments drop out leaving a guitar solo in a quiet passage. The first one on electric and the second on acoustic is neat. What I do enjoy are some of the more doomier qualities in the music, harkening back to Dehumanizer. But that said, I kinda wish the music had more going for it than just that. Like outside of the atmosphere, the music itself isn't super exciting to me, and it doesn't really fill me with a desire to revisit the album. The song structures are way more straightforward, which probably adds to that lack of interest. And look, it's not like I'm expecting these guys to pull out some groundbreaking new record and capture what they once had. I mean, if anything, they've already proved themselves with the other 3 Dio Sabbath records. But as someone who loves and is interested in music, I do appreciate an artist being able to refine and reinvent themselves after years and years of creating music. With this Heaven and Hell project, we're not exactly getting that. And I do like to go into these review type things with no expectations, but I gotta be honest, I wasn't really expecting much from this record, and not much I did receive upon listening to it. So it goes. Is this the end of the beginning? We finally reached the end, the last album of their career, and back together with Ozzy no less. It's kind of funny to me. In a lot of respects, the music on this album isn't that radically different from the past few Sabbath albums, but for some reason I enjoy it much more. Maybe it's simply just having Ozzy back at the helm and hearing the sound of his voice makes me excited again. The gritty, chilling quality of his voice is and forever will be perfect for Sabbath in my humble, biased opinion. I'm just gonna get this out of the way right out of the gate. Production-wise, I mean, it's been said time and time again that Rick Rubin ruined this one with the overcompression, and I agree. I really wish we could have heard this record in a slightly more raw way, less studio treatment. If anything, I would argue this is a lesson on how not to mix your album, but we just gotta roll with it. Something I have noticed is that the music I might argue is a bit slower paced than previous Sabbath albums. I mean, I'm not expecting the guys now in their mid-60s to outperform their 20-year-old selves. It does extend the track lengths by a considerable amount though. Over half the songs are 7 minutes or longer. Moving on to favorite tracks, End of the Beginning is no bombastic War Pigs or Sabbath Bloody Sabbath opener, but in a way it offers a great change of pace from the more conventional heavy metal tracks we've heard on the past few albums. In some respects, it's one of the doomiest things that Sabbath has ever done, and that aforementioned slower pace really adds to that. Lead single, God is Dead, isn't too bad. It's also pretty doomy, very slow moving, almost in a menacing kind of way with a few great riffs here and there. I do kind of wish Ozzy was wailing over the music in the louder sections, but I would imagine his vocal range might not have been what it was at this point, which is understandable. I also thought the Planet Caravan-esque Zeitgeist was pleasant. It really is extremely reminiscent of that song, but hey, it's a good song, so whatever. And the middle section of Age of Reason was fairly exciting, and even Live Forever had a few of those unexpected Sabbath curveballs. One thing I will say before I move on is I really love how the last track on the album, Dear Father, ends how Black Sabbath starts, with the rain and thunder and bell chimes in the distance, effectively creating a loop of the entire discography. Overall, it's not a bad album by any means. Certainly not as bad as what I thought it could have been, given what led up to it. There's a lot of material on it that reminds me of the earlier Ozzy era stuff in terms of riffs, structures, etc., and as a result, it feels very comfortable to me as a fan of that era. At the same time, I don't know if it's an album that I can say in all earnestness that I will revisit often, if at all. I enjoyed it for what it was, for the band coming back together one last time, sorry Bill, and hearing them do Black Sabbath for one final hurrah, but I don't really know if there's a lot there that excites me to want to recommend it or want to revisit it in the same way I love to revisit albums like Sabotage or Volume 4. But I think if you're curious about this album in any capacity, I'd say where's the harm in spending an afternoon to check it out. If anything, I've learned you could do much worse than the Black Sabbath catalog than this album. Oh my god, it's finally over! I started writing the script for this in late July, and I'm happy it's finally being put out in the world. If you enjoyed this video, please let me know so I can do more videos like this in the future. I enjoyed making this video, but next time let's do a discography with fewer albums. I mean, the Nirvana discography is right there. Anyways, thank you for watching. Please leave suggestions and thoughts about this video or things you would like to see in future videos in the comments below. As always, you can support me on Patreon or Ko-Fi, as well as check out some of my original music on Apple Music, Spotify, Bandcamp, and right here on YouTube. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.